Chief Daniel Mercer had spent most of his life chasing danger. For 20 years, he wore a badge and kept people safe, from high-speed chases to tense standoffs with criminals. He'd seen the worst parts of the city, but he never lost his cool. That's what made him such a good cop, and later a great police chief. But after 2 decades on the job, Dan was ready for something quieter. He wanted peace, routine, and maybe even a little boredom. So when he retired, he packed up and moved to a small suburban neighborhood about an hour outside the city. It was the kind of place where everyone waved hello. Dogs chased mail carriers, just for fun, and kids played hopscotch in driveways. The streets were clean, the lawns were green, and everything seemed peaceful. Dan bought a modest house at the end of a cul-de-sac. He didn't want anything fancy, just a place where he could relax, read a book, and maybe tinker with his old truck on weekends. He introduced himself as Dan and kept his title quiet at first. Most neighbors thought he was just another retiree looking for a fresh start. Life was good at first. He enjoyed the early morning walks, the friendly chats over fences, and the sound of birds instead of sirens. He even joined the local coffee shop's regular crowd, always ordering the same black coffee and sitting by the window. But there was one thing about the neighborhood that annoyed him. The HOA, or Homeowners Association. It was run by a group of residents who made sure every rule was followed to the letter. They cared about things like lawn height, mailbox color, and whether your car was parked in the driveway too long. Most people didn't mind. They figured it kept things looking nice. Then there was Karen Delaney. Karen was the head of the HOA board, and she took her job very seriously. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was hunting for violations. If someone left a toy in the yard, Karen would send a warning. If a fence looked faded, she'd issue a fine. Her emails to residents were polite on the surface but carried a clear message. You will follow the rules. At first, Dan ignored her. He kept his yard neat, paid his fees, and stayed out of trouble. But Karen noticed he didn't seem to care much about appearances. His flagpole was taller than the HOA guidelines allowed. His recycling bin was placed slightly off-center. Nothing serious, but enough for Karen to take note. She started watching him more closely. One day she sent him an email pointing out that his truck had been in the driveway for 4 days straight. She said it looked messy and violated the no long-term vehicle parking rule. Dan responded politely, explaining that he was working on the engine and would move it soon. Karen replied within minutes, saying, "Rules are rules." Dan sighed and shook his head. He knew this wasn't going to be the last time they clashed. Still, he tried to stay calm. He wasn't looking for a fight. He just wanted to live peacefully in his new home. But Karen didn't know who she was dealing with, and soon she was going to find out. Karen wasn't used to pushback. Most people in the neighborhood followed the rules without question. If she sent a notice, they fixed the problem. If she issued a fine, they paid it quickly. But Dan was different. He didn't argue, but he also didn't bend. When she wrote to him about the flagpole, he politely explained that it was within legal limits and not under HOA control. When she complained about his recycling bin placement, he adjusted it slightly but added a note. Thanks for keeping things in order. To others, it might have seemed like Dan was being respectful. To Karen, it felt like disrespect. She decided to step up her game. Soon, Dan began getting notices almost weekly. One week, it was a garden gnome that was too distracting. Another time, it was a bird feeder that supposedly attracted pests. Dan followed the rules each time, but it was clear Karen was targeting him. Neighbors started to notice. Some thought it was funny. Others felt bad for Dan. A few even whispered that Karen was picking on him because he didn't show her enough respect. But Dan stayed calm. He didn't write angry emails or slam doors. He simply did what needed to be done, documented everything, and kept moving. Then came the Saturday morning that changed everything. Dan had gone for a long jog through the neighborhood. He loved the crisp air and the quiet streets. When he returned, still catching his breath, he saw something strange. His garage door was locked, not broken, not stuck. Locked. There was a padlock across the opening, and a note taped to the metal. Your Vehicle has been reported as abandoned due to expired tags. Access denied until resolved. Dan stared at it for a moment. Then he laughed, not out of joy but disbelief. He walked around to the side gate, pulled out his phone, and started recording. He snapped photos of the lock, the note, and the garage itself. Then he called the local police station. "Hey," he said calmly. "This is Chief Mercer. I need an officer dispatched to my residence." The silence on the other end was brief, then quick. "Right away, sir." Karen had no idea what she had just done, and in just a short while, she was going to learn the truth. "Let me know if you'd like parts 3-7 expanded the same way." Dan stood in front of his locked garage, still catching his breath from the morning jog. Sweat was drying on his forehead, and the early sun beat down gently on his back. He looked at the padlock like it had personally insulted him. This wasn't just a mistake, this was personal. Karen had crossed a line, not just as an HOA leader, but as a neighbor. And Dan knew exactly what kind of message she was sending. You don't push back on me. But what Karen didn't know was that this wasn't some retired man with nothing better to do. She had just locked the garage of the town's top law enforcement officer. Still, Dan stayed calm. He always did. That was one of the first lessons he learned on the job. Anger clouds judgment. So instead of yelling, kicking the lock, or storming over to Karen's house, he pulled out his phone and started recording. He walked around the garage, taking clear video of the padlock, the note, and even the side gate where he'd entered. He took photos from every angle. Then he made sure to capture the look on his face, a mix of disbelief and amusement. He wasn't angry. He was ready. After finishing his documentation, Dan went inside through the front door and changed into clean clothes. He poured himself a glass of water, sat down at the kitchen table, and called the local police station. "Hey," he said when the dispatcher answered. "It's Chief Mercer. I need an officer dispatched to my home." There was a pause, just a second of silence, as if the person on the other end needed to process the fact that the chief of police was calling in a report. "Of course, sir. Right away." While he waited, Dan checked his car registration online. His license plates had been removed temporarily because he was updating some paperwork after moving into the neighborhood. It was a small thing, something most people would have asked about before jumping to action. But Karen hadn't done that. She'd gone straight for punishment. That told Dan everything he needed to know. About 20 minutes later, Officer Ruiz pulled up in his patrol car. He stepped out looking unsure of what he was walking into. "Chief," he greeted, tipping his head respectfully. Dan gave him a nod and led him around back. Without saying much, he handed Ruiz the printed documents proving that his tags weren't expired. They were simply off while he updated his address with the DMV. Ruiz read through them, then looked at the padlock. "So, this is real?" he asked. Dan smiled slightly. "Yep, welcome to suburban life." Ruiz shook his head, pulling out his notebook. "Do you want to file this formally?" Dan thought for a moment. He could have had Karen arrested for unlawful detainment of property. He could have had her fined. Hell, he could have had her kicked off the HOA board before lunch, but that wasn't who he was. "No arrests," he said finally. "But I want this documented. I want the record to show that someone abused their authority." Ruiz nodded and started writing. Just then, Karen appeared at her backyard fence, watching the scene unfold. Her face was tense, arms crossed, but there was something else in her eyes now. Confusion, then recognition. She had seen Officer Ruiz salute many officers before, but never the chief. And suddenly, realization hit her like a cold splash of water. The man she had locked out of his own garage wasn't just another homeowner, he was the police chief. Karen's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She blinked a few times, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Her brain scrambled to find a way to explain it away. Maybe the officer just respected older guys. Maybe Dan was friends with the chief. But deep down, she already knew. Officer Ruiz turned to Dan. "So, unless she had legal grounds to lock your garage, this is considered unlawful possession of property. It might even be criminal trespass." Dan nodded. "Exactly. Karen took a step closer, her voice sharp but uncertain. Wait, hold on. You're telling me you're the police chief? Dan turned to face her, hands in his pockets, completely relaxed. That's right. Karen's face paled. She looked between Dan and Ruiz, hoping someone would laugh, would tell her this was a joke. No one did. You never said anything. She stammered. Dan shrugged. I didn't think I had to. I figured we were just neighbors. Karen's lips pressed together. She was used to being in control, used to having power over situations. But now, standing in her backyard in slippers and a bathrobe, she felt smaller than ever. I thought you were just another resident, she said weakly. Dan held up the documents again. And yet, you didn't ask questions. You just assumed I broke the rules and punished me. Karen swallowed hard. She wanted to defend herself, to say she was only doing her job, but the truth was heavy in the air. She had overstepped. Badly. Officer Ruiz finished writing and looked at both of them. Well, Chief, I'll get this report filed. If you decide to take further action, we can handle that too. Dan nodded. Thanks, Ruiz. As the officer left, Karen stood frozen. Dan walked over to the padlock and removed it calmly. He didn't slam the garage door open or yell. He just went inside, grabbed a bottle of water, and came back out. Karen finally found her voice. I didn't know, she whispered. Dan looked at her, not with anger, but with disappointment. I know, he said. That's the problem. He turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Karen standing alone in her yard, staring after him. For the first time in a long time, Karen didn't feel powerful. She felt exposed. And worse, she knew the whole neighborhood was going to hear about this by dinner. By lunchtime, the entire neighborhood knew what had happened. It started with Officer Ruiz's patrol car parked outside Dan's house longer than usual. Then came Karen standing in her backyard, looking stunned and confused. Someone snapped a photo from behind their curtain and sent it to the neighborhood group chat. Within an hour, everyone was talking. Karen locked the police chief's garage. The reactions were mixed. Some people laughed out loud. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few longtime residents who had dealt with Karen's strictness for years felt a strange sense of justice. Dan didn't say anything online. He didn't post screenshots or call local news stations. He just went about his day like normal, watering his plants, checking his mail, and even waving politely at Karen when she stepped out again later that afternoon, but the damage was done. By evening, word had reached the HOA board. They held an emergency meeting the next morning. Karen tried to explain herself, saying she didn't know who Dan really was, that she was only doing her job and that she followed protocol. But the board wasn't interested in excuses. They reviewed past complaints and found a pattern. Karen had been overly aggressive with several homeowners. She had issued fines for minor issues, threatened legal action over small violations, and made life difficult for anyone who questioned her decisions. This time, she had gone too far. The HOA voted to take disciplinary action. Karen was removed from her position as head of the board. She could still live in the neighborhood, but she no longer had any authority over its rules. For the first time in years, the community breathed easier. Neighbors who used to whisper behind closed doors now spoke freely. They shared stories of how Karen had once fined someone for hanging holiday lights a week late, or called the city because a teenager left a skateboard on the porch. Now they laughed about it. More importantly, the HOA decided it was time for change. They brought in a new leader, someone calmer, more understanding. They rewrote parts of the rulebook, removing outdated policies and making enforcement fairer. They even added a suggestion box so residents could voice concerns without fear. And slowly, the neighborhood began to feel like home again. One Saturday, Dan was out mowing his lawn when a neighbor stopped by, Mrs. Collins, an older woman who lived 2 houses down. She smiled warmly. I just wanted to say thank you, she said. Dan turned off the mower and wiped his forehead. For what? For not making a big scene, she replied. You could have crushed Karen, but you handled it with class. Dan chuckled. She got what was coming. I just made sure it was done right. Mrs. Collins nodded. Well, things are already better around here. People aren't walking on eggshells anymore. Dan looked around. The streets were quieter now. Not because people were scared, but because they felt safe. That night he sat on his porch with a cold drink, watching the sun dip below the trees. For the first time in weeks, there were no HOA emails waiting in his inbox. Just peace. And it felt good. In the weeks that followed, the changes became clear. The new HOA board met regularly and kept everything open. Residents were invited to attend meetings, offer opinions, and even vote on some decisions. Fines were reviewed carefully before being issued. And most importantly, everyone was treated with respect. Karen stayed quiet. She didn't leave the neighborhood, but she kept to herself. No more emails, no more warnings, no more surprise inspections. She still walked her dog every morning, always keeping her head low when she passed Dan's house. Some people expected Dan to enjoy seeing her fall from power, but he didn't celebrate. He never wanted to humiliate her. He just wanted fairness. Still, the experience taught him something important. People in positions of authority, even small ones, needed to be reminded that power wasn't about control, it was about service. So one afternoon, Dan showed up at the next HOA meeting. He didn't come to speak against anyone or demand changes. He came to offer help. I've spent most of my life enforcing rules, he told the board. Not just laws, but policies, guidelines, and safety measures. I understand how easy it is to lose perspective when you think you're doing the right thing. The room listened closely. My advice to you all is this. Always ask questions before taking action. Always listen to both sides. And most of all, don't let authority make you forget what it means to be a neighbor. There was a round of polite applause after he finished speaking. Later, the new HOA chair, Mr. Patel, approached him. We'd love to have you sit in on future meetings. If you're willing, he said. Your insight would mean a lot. Dan thought about it for a moment. I'll consider it, he said with a smile. But only if we keep things calm and reasonable. Mr. Patel laughed. Deal. As Dan walked out into the evening air, he felt lighter. Not because he had won some kind of battle, but because balance had returned. Life in the neighborhood continued peacefully. Children played in driveways again. People hosted weekend barbecues. The streets were lined with friendly greetings and warm smiles. And every now and then, Dan would catch a glimpse of Karen walking her dog, keeping her distance, staying quiet. He didn't hold a grudge. He simply moved forward. Because that's what real leaders do. A few months passed and life in the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The HOA was doing better than ever, not because they were stricter, but because they were fairer. People didn't dread getting mail from them anymore. They actually looked forward to updates, sometimes even smiling when they saw the subject line in their inbox. Karen had become a background figure. She still lived in her house, still walked her dog every morning, still kept her lawn perfectly trimmed, but she never brought up the HOA again. She stopped trying to correct people's mailbox colors or send reminders about holiday decorations. It was like she had finally learned something important. Power without kindness means nothing. Dan noticed the change, not just in Karen, but in everyone around him. Neighbors who used to keep to themselves now waved hello. Kids played outside, more often laughing and chasing each other down the sidewalk. There was a sense of community again, one built on trust, not fear. One afternoon, Dan sat on his porch sipping a glass of iced tea. The sun was warm, but there was a soft breeze that made it comfortable. He watched as a group of kids played hopscotch near the corner, while a man across the street washed his car and hummed along to music playing from his phone. It was peaceful. He leaned back in his chair, letting the calm wash over him. This was what he had moved here for. Not drama, not conflict, not power struggles. Just quiet, steady living. He thought about everything that had happened, the lock on his garage, the shocked look on Karen's face, the meetings, the changes. It all seemed like a long time ago now. Not because it had been months, but because things had shifted so much since then. And he realized something. Karen hadn't been evil. She had just misunderstood what leadership meant. She thought authority meant control. She believed rules existed to be enforced, not explained. And in her mind, she was doing the right thing, but Dan knew better. He had spent 20 years learning that real leadership isn't about making people follow you out of fear. It's about earning their respect through fairness, patience, and understanding. It's about knowing when to speak up and when to listen. He also knew that if he had reacted with anger, if he had used his position to shut Karen down completely, things might not have changed for the better. Instead, he had chosen to respond with dignity. He had shown the neighborhood that strength doesn't come from yelling louder. It comes from staying calm, being reasonable, and doing the right thing, even when others don't. That's when someone interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Collins, the neighbor who had thanked him before, stepped onto the sidewalk and waved. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Dan smiled and gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Please do." She sat down with a cup of coffee in her hand, looking out at the street. "You've made a difference around here," she said after a moment. Dan shook his head. "I just did what needed to be done." "No," she corrected gently. "You could have taken the easy way. You could have made Karen feel small, but you didn't. You gave her a chance to see herself through someone else's eyes. That took strength." Dan looked at her and smiled. "Maybe." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the world go by. Then Mrs. Collins stood up, finishing her coffee. "Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you, again." Dan nodded. "Anytime." As she walked away, Dan stayed on his porch, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The birds chirped, the wind whispered through the trees, and for the first time in a while, everything felt exactly as it should, because peace wasn't just about quiet streets and clean lawns. It was about respect, about balance, about knowing who you are, and using that knowledge to make things better for everyone. And that's exactly what Dan had done.